Hello, my name's Annie Drew and I'm an intern at the Peggy Guggenheim collection here in Venice. My Peggy talk today is about extremes, the highs and lows of Peggy's life and how she dealt with them. The first extreme I would like to talk about today is wealth. Peggy was born in 1898 into a fabulously wealthy family in New York. Her grandfather had made the family fortune, and at the beginning of the First World War, it was said that the Guggenheims owned 75 to 80% of the world's silver, copper, and lead. So they wanted for nothing as a family. And he had 6 children, the youngest of whom was Benjamin, who was Peggy's father. Benjamin, I think, was the darling of the family and didn't go to business school like his brothers, but instead became a playboy. Her mother was a Seligman, Dorothea Seligman, who were also very rich, and they were from a banking family. So on the face of it, Peggy wanted for nothing. She was born into and grew up in a very privileged, with a very privileged background. But the downside of this was, in fact, she was very lonely. She didn't go to school. She had governesses and nannies who weren't very kind to her. She had an older sister, Benita, who she was very close to. But her younger sister was a lot younger. Her younger sister Hazel was a lot younger than her. So she didn't have much to do with her. So really it was Peggy and Benita. So she had a lonely childhood. And things got worse for Peggy. In 1912, her father was on the Titanic when it sank. It was reported that he valiantly gave up his place on the lifeboat for the women and children. And one woman in particular that was reported to be his wife, but in fact, his wife was at home in New York and it was one of his girlfriends. So very embarrassing and humiliating for Peggy and her mother and her sisters. In 1919, when she was 21, I think Peggy was very keen to make her be a bit more independent, to leave her family that she wasn't terribly close to and didn't feel really a part of. And having worked in a bookstore in New York, a very avant-garde bookstore, she got a taste for what was going on in Paris. So in 1921, she left for Paris on her own. And when she arrived in Paris, she became part of the whole art scene there through meeting Laurence Vail. And she met people like Marcel Duchamp, who became not just a lifelong friend to Peggy, but also an advisor for much of the rest of her life, and guided her in a lot of what she did. So she married Laurence Vail, which should have been a positive highlight, but in fact was turned out to be a low. Their marriage was not a happy one. They had 2 children, Peggy and Sinbad. Sinbad was the elder son, they in 1927 a further down for Peggy, because her beloved elder sister Benita died in childbirth. Having tried to have children for a long time, she finally became pregnant but died in childbirth. So that was very hard for Peggy, and she said that was the fact that Laurence was so unsympathetic to her at that time was the final reason for leaving him. She then met John Holmes, and John Holmes was an English writer, that was a big high for 5 years in Peggy's life. She was very happy with John Holmes and said afterwards he was the one true love of her life. And in the summertime, she would have the children together. Another difficulty for Peggy had been that she'd had to choose between having both of her children but being on her own, or giving up Sinbad to Lawrence to bring up if she wanted to stay with John Holmes. And I think she found that incredibly difficult. But in the summertime, they would all be together, and she had these wonderful holidays with John Holmes. But one time when they were riding together, he fell off his horse and he broke his wrist. It wasn't a major break, but it continued to trouble him. And when they were in London, he had advice from a surgeon to say that it would be a very simple operation to fix it. Unfortunately, he quite liked to drink, and he drank the night before his operation, and they think that's why he never woke up from the general anaesthetic. So Peggy has now lost her father, and she's lost her sister, and she has lost the one true love of her life. But she turns this around to be a positive, because she really thinks about what she wants to do with the rest of her life. And she decides that she would like to open an art gallery. So she takes the advice of Samuel Beckett, who tells her that perhaps she should concentrate on art of her time then, contemporary art. And she also has help from Marcel Duchamp, who advises her to collect surrealist and abstract artists. So the first art exhibition they put on is John Cocteau, who isn't a surrealist or an abstract artist, and he shows his work from, well, he would like to show his work from his play Knights of the Round Table, which are drawings and furniture, which brings me down to the next down, because she has problems with the customs, the British customs. She has a problem with the British customs, who won't allow one of the artworks because it shows a little bit of pubic hair, despite Cocteau's attempts to cover it up with vine leaves. But she goes down to the customs office and persuades them to release the painting. And so she has allowed the painting on condition that it's not shown to the public. So she puts it in her office for the duration of the exhibition, and rather falls in love with it herself and buys it. It's not the first piece of art she collects, because that is a sculpture by Arp, but it is certainly the beginning of her collection. She then has a first exhibition in England of Kandinsky, and that is a huge success, but she doesn't sell anything. And then she has an exhibition, a joint exhibition, a group exhibition, and has another run-in with customs, another downer, because the director of the Tate Gallery in London refuses to certify some of the pieces as art. And if they're not art, then they come under the heading manufactured goods, which means that they are subject to much higher tariffs for import duties. Peggy, being Peggy, does not give up, but decides to take the matter to court. So she goes to court and she wins. So she's turned this negative into a huge positive, because this gives a lot of recognition and credibility to the whole modern art movement. So running the gallery has been an interesting thing for Peggy to do, but it hasn't made very much money. And her heart is really elsewhere now. She feels what she'd really like to do, rather than run a gallery, is to have some sort of museum. She was probably influenced in this by her uncle, Solomon Guggenheim, of the famed Guggenheim in New York. But at this stage, it is called the Museum of Non-Objective Art. And he is also trying to help modern artists, and I'm sure that's an influence on Peggy. So Peggy then decides that she wants to set up this museum rather than gallery, and she enlists the help of Herbert Reed, and he helps her to draw up a list of the artists that they might show at this museum. and Marcel Duchamp then looks at the list again and alters it a little. But she sets off to Paris to buy these paintings. But very soon the war has broken out, and she realizes that her museum is not going to be able to continue under those circumstances. So she decides to buy the paintings for herself. So the good news is that she manages to buy a painting a day, or that's certainly her goal, is to buy a painting a day. But the bad news is that the Germans are advancing, and not only is the problem that she is Jewish, but also the Germans, Hitler hated modern art, and the year before he'd had an exhibition called the exhibition Degenerative Art, where he'd shown over 600 paintings of everything that you didn't want to collect, and for all the reasons why modern art was degenerative. And they were burning books, they were burning paintings. It was not a time to be around in Paris. But amazingly, Peggy stays for quite a while and continues to buy up works of art, 120 in all, costing only $40,000 at the time. And I have a list of some of the works that she collected, her shopping list. So we have 10 Picassos, 40 Ernsts, 4 Magrittes, 4 Ferens, 3 Man Rays, 3 Dalis, 1 Klee, and 1 Wolfgang Paulin, 1 Chagall, and Brancusi's Bird in Space. It's quite an amazing collection. But her next problem was what to do with these wonderful works of art. So she approaches the Louvre and asks them if they might store them for her. And initially they say yes, and then they say no, because they decide that they are just not valuable enough and that they're too contemporary for them to be interested. So she stores them in the south of France and eventually finds a friend who helps her ship them back to America, and they are labelled up as household goods, and they have to put a different name on it because Guggenheim sounds too Jewish. So with a different name and packed in blankets with pots and pans all over them, her collection goes back to New York. Peggy doesn't want to leave until she knows her collection is safe, and then she helps Max Ernst and his son to escape to America, and also Andre Breton and his family. I think there are 13 of them in total who all escape together, and she helps them financially and she helps them to get visas to return to New York. So in 1941 she is back in New York with Max Ernst, and the two of them get married. That was a high. Except that Max Ernst isn't really in love with Peggy. He is in love with Leonora Carrington. And not her. And I think that's really hard for Peggy. But Peggy, being Peggy, doesn't give up. She throws herself into her new project, which is to set up the museum that she couldn't set up in London. She now sets it up in New York. And this becomes an outpost for all of the avant-garde artists who have also escaped from Europe, and becomes this wonderful meeting point between both the avant-garde artists of Europe and also the up-and-coming younger artists in America that become the abstract expressionists of the future. So the opening night is 1942. Peggy arrives with 2 different earrings. One has been given to her by Yves Tanguy and the other by Calder, and she says it's to show that she has no bias towards either surrealist or abstract art. And her exhibitions are a huge success. Art of the Century is the most amazing building. It's housed in the most amazing building. It's on the 7th floor, and it's it has 4 galleries. One is a commercial gallery, and then she has a gallery for the abstract art, the cubist art, and kinetic art. And in the surrealist part of the gallery, the walls are curved inwards, and it's all dark, and the pictures don't have any framework, and the sculptures hang from the ceiling, and the lights go on and off periodically. Sometimes it's immersed in total darkness, and the noise of a train whistling through comes through quite regularly. So very, very different. And people were spellbound by what she had created, and it became a real focal point for New York and for art. And one of the people that she promotes through that museum is Jackson Pollock. She has a spring salon, and he is one of the people who applies with his artwork. She isn't terribly convinced, I think, to start with, but other people on her committee persuade her to give him a chance. So she gives him a 5-year contract, and she pays him $150 a month initially, and he is then able to just create art. I think she was always slightly amused that she stole him away from her uncle Solomon Guggenheim's museum, where he was simply a carpenter who helped put the exhibitions together. And she was very proud of the fact that she launched the career of somebody who turned out to be so successful. So that was obviously a huge high for Peggy. In 1946, Peggy decides to write her memoirs. She has them published. They're very frank, both about her own life and that of her family. In fact, her uncles are so horrified by what's in them that they try to buy the entire print run, unsuccessfully, thankfully. So we all get to enjoy them. And the truth, certainly as Peggy saw it, I don't think her time in New York had been... It had been sort of happy and sad at the same time. She was very proud of what she'd achieved through her museum, but I think it was quite hard work as well. Initially, she was helped by Max Ernst's son, Jimmy, but when Jimmy left, the person that replaced him to help her run the gallery really wasn't any good, wasn't there. She said she spent most of the time answering the phone for him and his friends, and I think she found it very stressful and a huge burden, and I think when the war ended, she just wanted to go back to Europe. So she went back to Europe in 1947, and in 1948 she was invited to have a pavilion in the Venice Biennale. The Greek pavilion was available because the Greeks were having a civil war, and Peggy was really pleased to bring her artworks from America, and it was the first time that they'd been shown all together in Europe, and she was very amused that where you had the list of countries that all had a pavilion, and one of the countries listed was Guggenheim. And I can't think of anything negative to say about a low for the Biennale, because it was all a high, and her work was really well received, and I think Peggy felt she'd kind of come home. So then she set about finding a home, and in 1949 she found the Palazzo Vernier, also known as the Palazzo Non Finito, because it is simply a one-story building. Originally it was designed in the mid-1700s to have 5 floors, but it was never completed, and for Peggy it was just perfect. So Peggy settled there with her collection, and in 1951 she opened it up to the public for 3 days a week. And that was a huge success. And then, very, very sadly, in 1967, Peggy committed suicide, which Peggy always thought that it was a cry for help and that she hadn't committed suicide. But that obviously was a terrible blow for Peggy, just when things sort of felt as if they were going right. But a positive note was 2 years later, she was invited to show her collection at the Guggenheim in New York. So there had always been this slight competition, I think, between them and family rivalry, I think, better than competition. There'd always been a family rivalry going on, that she felt that they hadn't been terribly supportive of her in the past. Particularly the director of the museum, who she had a sort of a lifelong run-in with. But anyway, all things were laid aside, and she took her collection to New York, and the show was a huge success. And I think a lot of the earlier rifts were healed, and Peggy decided to leave her collection to the Solomon Guggenheim Foundation. Which is what happened when Peggy died in 1979. Everything was left to the Guggenheim Foundation, but on the condition that it doesn't ever get split up and it doesn't ever leave Venice. And Peggy is still here in Venice in her beloved palazzo. Her ashes are interned with her dogs, next to her dogs, and yes, so in making this talk, I was thinking as well about the situation we have now with the coronavirus, and I was wondering if Peggy was still here with her collection, what she would have made of it all. And my conclusion was that I think she would have welcomed the fact that she had her collection. She would obviously be very anxious about the whole situation for the world, but not for herself. But Peggy was not somebody who really kind of worried about her own self or safety or anything else. She was very focused, and everything was about her collection. And I like to think of Peggy there now, that because the museums had to close, that she has it all to herself, which, you know, it's wonderful that it's shared, and it's wonderful that it's always so full of people who want to come and see her work for themselves. But I think just for a few weeks or hopefully not too long, but she would have the collection, her beloved collection, all back to herself. Thank you very much for listening.